So my talk today is about why technical leadership matters. And I guess for out of interest, I'd be interested to see who we have in the room. So I'd like to get you to put your hand up if you consider yourself an engineer or a developer. Okay. If you're maybe a tech lead or an engineering manager of some sort. Some sort of architect. Maybe some higher level management like a CTO or something like that. Okay, cool. So what I hope to do today is really talk about why some of these roles are really important. If you're an engineer, I guess maybe one of the questions that you'll be asking yourself is, why would I want to move away from being a developer and an engineer? And what is the result of that? If you're an existing, say, tech lead or engineering manager or higher up, I guess the question is, well, why does it matter so much? And how, more importantly, can I be effective as a technical lead or leader in my organization? Just as a reminder, there's an app, so it'd be great if you could rate this presentation at the end. Or if you have questions, there'll be some time at the end to be able to ask a couple of those questions. So I work for Thoughtworks. Some of you may know us. We publish a radar, which is kind of a trend of what we see throughout the industry, through our clients. It's kind of an opinionated view of what trends we're seeing throughout the world. And we're kind of, I guess, known for publishing things around continuous delivery and the lean enterprise, and some of our luminaries like Martin Fowler and Jim Highsmith. As employee of Thoughtworks, I work as a sort of architect or a tech lead. And one of my passions is really around building out the next generation of technical leaders. So this is actually a topic that's really close to my heart. As a background, I'm a sort of Java, .NET, and Ruby developer, done some sort of JavaScript stuff. And I still dabble in writing code. And I guess this is one of my kind of interesting points of being both of these sort of positions of both being an influencer and building out leaders, but also still being a developer at some level. And I guess the first question is, well, what is it that happens if we don't actually have technical leadership? So maybe you can think about some of maybe the teams or environments that you've worked in, and think about an instance where perhaps there was a lack of technical leadership. I guess one of the benefits of consulting is that we see lots of different organizations, clients, and I've definitely worked with lots of teams. Some may be very functional, some may be less dysfunctional or more dysfunctional. And some of the classic sort of symptoms I see about a lack of technical leadership are perhaps things when you get 5 persistence frameworks on the same application. Perhaps things like 3 different types of automated test frameworks. Maybe 5 parallel branches, or even worse, even more, 1 per developer. And maybe even a hand-rolled source control system. Who's seen some of these things on their sort of projects or applications? Okay. So the question is, well, what was missing in that sort of environment? And actually, this sort of situation all happened on the same sort of project. So kind of scary if you're actually working on that. And some of the hands in this kind of room have maybe indicated it's not really the only time that this sort of thing, this sort of lack of leadership actually happens. And a tweet that I sort of captured a while ago that captures this is really from an ex-colleague of mine called Julian Boot. And he talks about, I had 10 guys on my last project, all of them had opinions, and all of them were expressed in the code base. So maybe you can think about all the arguments amongst the developers that you've worked with, about tabs versus spaces, curly braces on the same line or not, small stylistic things, and then amplifying that to the way that people actually solve problems as well, the tools that they use. We're very passionate about tools. We're a bit sort of fashion frenzied about what the latest tool is and if we're actually using that. And a lot of that contributes to this sort of conflict that we have on the teams. And this is where we need actually strong technical leadership around guiding teams to be heading in the same sort of direction. So the analogy that I tend to use is that when we work on building software, we're building software for a purpose. So there's a reason for that software. And as much as we try to get people to understand what that goal is, so whether or not it's an internal application, whether or not it's an API or some sort of platform service that our internal developers are using, or an external product, there's some business reason why that software exists. And in today's sort of ecosystem, it's very hard to actually be a solo developer. Even at the smallest startups, you'll end up with at least a team of 5 people very rapidly. There's too many sort of technologies and surface areas that we need to take care of if we think about mobile, offline, if we're talking about sort of physical clients or hardware, server side, that we can't actually do all of this ourselves. And so we kind of necessitate having to work with other people because we need to have a whole bunch of skills. And when we sort of talk about what we're actually trying to deliver, what often happens in sort of my experience is that people start moving into different directions. So maybe you can think about some of the teams where you saw some of the dysfunction. And you might have a developer who's excited about using the latest and greatest tool or library or framework. I hear Facebook just published a new sort of NPM sort of package manager. You'll have some developer who wants to use that. Other people might treat the project as it's a time for me to actually use an interesting algorithm to solve this challenging problem. Other people will be about maybe spiking out and exploring new technologies. And you'll have other developers who are really focused on delivering what you're trying to do. And so the biggest influence that we can have when we're thinking about technical leadership is thinking about how divergent are we in our sort of development teams about moving towards in the same direction. And so maybe the corollary is when we're actually thinking about this team of people that we have, we want to be thinking about what are the actions that we have that are sort of slowly guiding people towards the same way. There's no single way that you can actually talk to people about here's what the goal is. There is no single chance that you can sort of say, I've emailed the goal of this project out, now you should all understand it. People are very complicated, and when you step into leadership positions, you'll appreciate that people have different styles of communication. Other people will prefer to have maybe one-to-one conversations, and you'll need to repeat that message several times. Other people will sort of prefer having sort of written communications rather than talking about things all the time. Some people don't even deal with words, they prefer visuals. And so when we're actually thinking about herding sort of the team towards this goal, we need to be thinking about not just a single way of making sure that happens, but actually thinking about how we're sort of encouraging people multiple times over time towards the same different goal. I think a key part as well is that software systems evolve according to the sort of environment in which we're working in as well. And the goal of a system, say at the very beginning of a system, will actually change over time as well. A really good example is when you sort of follow sort of startups where the goal is probably trying to find the right market fit, trying to attract the right sort of customers, but at some certain point, you're going to have to think about scaling performance and then actually making that actually work at an infrastructure level as well. And so what you start off with as an initial goal for software will actually change over time. As more people use your system, security will become an even more important aspect. And Owen gave a really great talk about building security in from the start earlier in this track. And more of that will actually be more important as your sort of customer base grows. And this is where, as sort of technical leaders, we need to be thinking about not just that sort of end state as a single starting point, but actually how it evolves over time as well, and what we're doing to sort of slowly nudge people towards the current set of goals. So my hypothesis is around thinking about technical leadership matters. We've kind of explored what happens if we have a missing amount of technical leadership. We end up with too much complexity, and that really just gets in the way. And the way that I often explain this to people, particularly developers thinking about moving into leadership roles, is thinking about perhaps the difference of what you actually control in your day-to-day work. So as a developer, and I know this, you will go to your sort of computer, you might even get to pair program with somebody, so you might check out some code, you'll probably have some sort of feature or some sort of bug to sort of work on, and then you'll be sort of writing code and maybe tests and trying to sort of get that sort of functionality working. So your sort of sphere of control is kind of the code that you actually write on your sort of computer. And there's a lot of things that I hear about developers when you work with teams, and one of the biggest things is this thing about, there's things in our environment that just get in the way. There's people that are constantly interrupting me to ask me about this sort of information. There's maybe challenges about disagreements from other developers about how you might approach this problem. And there are things that, as a developer, you feel are outside of your control, but you get to control the code that you write. And this is about thinking about how much impact you have, and maybe trading off how much influence you have as well. So as a developer, the impact that you have is in terms of the business functionality or the impact that your code has. But maybe your influence is a lot less limited because you can only really talk to the team that you have, or maybe the other people that you have social connections with in your organization. When you think in terms of being a leader, a tech leader of some sort, your perspective actually changes quite a lot. So, probably one of the biggest jokes, I guess, in our industry is that when people sort of move into leadership positions, there's this whole thing about being post-technical. And that's because there's a whole bunch of other things that get in the way. And if you're a sort of tech leader of some sort, you won't be able to write as much code as part of your day-to-day work. You might be able to do that for some time, but it won't be a sustainable amount of time. And one of the reasons for this is that suddenly you're thinking about more than just the code, you're thinking about the team and the environment in which that sort of code is working. And so your sort of deliverable about what you're actually trying to work on isn't necessarily about the code that you write, but it's actually about thinking about the collective code that the team that you're working with is actually responsible for. And so one of the really great analogies is thinking about, you're not really coding about, the code that you write isn't really so important as the code that your team writes. And you get to sort of program through, say, your team, rather than you individually writing every single line of code. And the biggest shift here is that sort of mental shift from the doing to the enabling. And this is where the biggest thing is thinking about how you amplify your impact as a tech lead. So what are the things that you can do that help your developers get more effective? Sometimes this is about navigating conflict within your team. Sometimes this is about exploring perhaps several ideas that your team has about solving the right problem. Sometimes it's about creating enough space for your sort of engineering team to be able to explore and learn new technologies so they become more effective. And an individual developer might complain about lack of that sort of maybe time to explore new technologies. But as a tech leader, you're really trying to think about how you sort of carve out some of this time and what you do to actually enable your developers to be more effective. So we can do things around the alignment to make sure that everyone's heading in the same direction, but we can also do things to sort of help amplify the effectiveness of our developers. And this is the biggest shift, is that you have less individual impact on the code base, but you have broader influence. And this is what we're kind of trading off as we move into more technical leadership roles. There is something about this, though, that we need to be thinking about, that we have a responsibility when we have more influence. And this is a little bit of a warning, because I have seen many situations where technical leadership is like the analogy of water, where water is this sort of sustaining kind of liquid that we kind of need in order to survive. But in the wrong sort of situation, the wrong quantities, it can be dangerous as well. So we can maybe drown in water, or maybe we have too much salt water and not enough. And I want to sort of share an experience that I saw at a client of mine. I was working on a team quite separate to them, but near enough to hear what was actually going on. And for me, it was a really sort of good example about what not to do in a technical leadership role. So once upon a time, there was a team, and there was a team with a lead architect who was sort of the tech lead for this team. And this tech lead wanted to introduce a really exciting new technology, which at that time was sort of key value store databases. So the application or platform that they had a huge scaling problem. And instead of using the relational database, which was theorized as the bottleneck for the performance problem, they said, what we need to do is we need to redevelop the entire application using a key value store, because we'll be a lot faster there, we'll scale a lot faster, and this is the thing that we need to actually invest in. The sort of architect was able to convince the business to invest in this sort of proposition, and ended up sort of carving out a small team of 2 developers who would sort of maintain the old system on the relational database, where he would sort of gather the team around him and lead them to building this new key value store. Now, in an ideal world, this sounds like a really fantastic proposition, right? So performance problem, there's a real business benefit. As a team, we can understand the purpose of that. And if you've read any of Dan Pink's Drive book, mastery, autonomy, and purpose are things that people want to have in order to be happy at work. And so having a really strong purpose around having a business benefit, doing something really exciting with new technology is a really appealing thing for us to do as developers. what was interesting was, I guess, some of the timelines around this. So 8 months later, this team was still redeveloping this relational database into this sort of key value store. They obviously had sort of production problems with the existing sort of system, and new features would be added all the time. So they would have to also think about how they migrated those existing sort of new features to the new platform. And unfortunately, at some point, they ended up doing some more performance testing and actually worked out this new platform they developed wasn't any more performant than the existing system. So they hadn't actually worked out what the bottleneck was. And the organization ended up canceling the project. Now, if you're as a developer thinking about the impact of your individual work, you've just spent 8 months of your time writing some software that just got thrown away. And this is a big lesson for us to have as tech leads, is that when we have this influence and impact on the team, we need to also be careful about what we do with the sort of authority and influence that we have. And this is where the biggest thing is thinking about how your technical vision matters. So when you're thinking about what that goal is, you're thinking about, is it actually a useful goal? And what can I do to actually test to make sure it's actually working? The other thing is, as a tech lead, you need to be careful about not wanting to implement your technical vision yourself. So a lot of your sort of role is away from doing and enabling. I worked with another tech lead very early in my career, and I have to say it was quite a scarring experience in sort of my life. And it's something that I really hold in my regard about what not to do as a sort of tech lead. So we had a team of really bright developers, really excited, building a new sort of client application process that would take in sort of complex forms, and then they would be able to process the applications to understand whether or not their clients would actually fit the sort of registration process. And the tech lead had this wonderful idea about introducing really rigorous functional programming and objects in such a way that it was quite different from maybe your typical, say, MVC style that was very popular with, say, Spring Framework at a time. But what was interesting is that we'd work on stories, we'd get to build features, and then we would go home. And the next day we would come in and kind of recognize something about the code base that it'd be completely refactored overnight. How would you feel as a developer if you sort of had this sort of feedback, not direct, but indirect, through the code base, that the code that you'd written wasn't good enough, and it was going to be rewritten in a style that was completely abstract to you? And this is where your technical vision isn't really about you implementing this. It's really about you helping your team understand and giving your team the skills such that they can help implement that vision. And you can imagine what the effect was with the rest of the developers as we started to write more code, is that we knew in the evening the tech lead would end up rewriting all of this code. So do you think we started to care about code quality? We still did. We still wanted to write tests. But we understood what would actually happen. And so this is a warning for us as tech leads not to fall into that trap of wanting to do everything for ourselves. So what makes a good tech lead? And I guess this is a good question to ask. How would you boil it down into a single question? For me, one of mine is really thinking about, does the code base look like it was written by a single person? So it'll never ever happen. I know this from a fact. But if you can imagine squinting a little bit, where the code gets a little bit fuzzy, and maybe you can start to see the shape of that code, what you're really looking for is there similarities across the code base? Even the code that we write ourselves over maybe a 3-year period, we will learn things as we go, and we'll hopefully improve the way that we write code. But the most important thing is thinking about, as your team is writing, how consistent are they as a whole unit around working out code that kind of looks very similar. Now, I've done a lot of training around sort of tech leadership. Internally to our company, we run a yearly program around building skills for new tech leaders. And one of the biggest questions that we often have with developers looking at more senior roles is the architect or a tech lead the only role that you can have in order to stay technical? So you'll have the post-technical track, which engineers maybe don't want to have. And then the question is, well, what other opportunities are there for people if they want to stay technical? And this is where we want to really talk about leadership, not just leaders. So not just the people, but what are the roles and what impact are people having? What's the influence that an individual engineer is actually having? So a quick test for people, and hopefully we can get some good answers here. Who's this person here? Okay, Martin Fowler, very good. And Martin's probably well known for probably writing books on refactoring, writing articles about what's going on in industry. This person here? Kathy Sierra, right. She just published a book called Badass, Making Users Awesome, and also was probably most famous for also starting off the Head First catalog of book around sort of Head First design patterns. This person here shouldn't be of any surprise to people here, hopefully. Rebecca, yeah, Worthbrox, who's responsible or known for responsibility-driven design. Any ideas here? Any closure people around? So Stuart Holloway, who's probably most known for talking about functional programming, but also one of the core people about leading closure. And I think one of the interesting things about our industry is that technical leadership doesn't necessarily need to be you're leading a development team. And what's interesting about people like the people that I've sort of picked up on this sort of slide is thinking about what impact that they're having and influence that they're having about encouraging people to adopt really good practices. So in a lot of the organizations that we work in, one of the more popular sort of practices that we see organizationally is this idea around sort of a software craftsmanship guild. So bringing people together in the organization around, being passionate about software as a craft. And a form of technical leadership that people can have is by simply creating that community in that guild and getting people together at a regular part. Those people aren't necessarily the sort of architect or tech leads of the teams that these software engineers are in, but what they're doing is actually bringing together a collective set of people to learn from each other and to encourage people to learn things. You have luminaries as well that are sort of writing and publishing and getting people to adopt, new knowledge. There's one thing about our industry that never changes, and that's the fact that there's always new tools and technologies out there. So there are always new things for us to learn. The surface area of all those sorts of different platforms is just too much for us to have. And so we need people that are also there leading the way and encouraging people to sort of learn about new things. And this is where I often say to people, everyone can be a leader regardless of what role or title that you have. So in a lot of organizations, the role of that person bringing together that sort of software guild isn't a person who is maybe paid or given that extra title, but they do it because they're passionate about it. And this is where it's the big difference between leadership and leaders, is that people who are demonstrating leadership are doing it and they're creating sort of a following. They want people to learn something about, something that they're passionate about and getting people to grow and learn. They're not given a title. And although as a leader, when you're given a title, you're expected to demonstrate leadership, I've also seen a lot of people who take on a title and they don't demonstrate leadership. But the key point here is that everyone can be a leader regardless of what title that you've actually been given. So if you're an engineer in your organization right now, think about how you can be an advocate. Show your passion about things and gather like-minded people and lead the way that makes it a lot easier for people. One of the, interesting ways of looking at the sort of technical leadership role is thinking about maybe 3 different elements to it. So one of them is thinking about the developer. So as a developer, I would hope that you'd be able to write clean code, you'd have good skills at being able to write automated tests. But one of the things that you want to have is thinking about also architecture. So when you think about architecture and not having the architect role, but you're thinking about systems, longer term decisions, not just about the code structure that you're writing, but also maybe about the environment in which that sort of system is going to be sort of deployed and operated, and thinking about sort of longer term decisions about reducing the overall cost of change or the overall operating cost. But a good balance of a tech leader is thinking about 3 elements, and the final one is thinking about the leader circle. You're thinking about maybe how you're communicating things, you're thinking about how you gather other people around you to follow a sort of topic that you're really passionate about. And if you're actually leading development teams, this is where I'd be thinking about how much diversity you have in teams. There's been a lot of studies recently that have sort of talked about what makes a really great team. And one of the probably most difficult things that we have in our industry is the hiring process, where when we sort of talk about we want to have people who are culturally fit, we also need to be careful that looking for cultural fit doesn't remove a certain type of diversity that you want. One of my most favorite books around exploring different types of diversity is this book called Strengths Finder. How many people have actually done this book? Okay, it's quite a few. If you haven't, I recommend doing it. I love all sort of personality self-assessment type models. They're all broken, but really interesting. The Strengths Finder book was written by some people from the Gallup organization. And the Gallup organization does like huge amounts of surveys across large organizations over a long period of time. So they have a lot of data. And one of the interesting things that they sort of picked up was sort of traits that made people successful at the roles that they do. And they kind of came up with about 34 different signature strengths. And what was really interesting about it is that the people who are more successful tended to focus a lot more on their strengths rather than focusing on weaknesses. So, you know, when you're thinking about personal development, when you're thinking about growth, you might be thinking about, oh, what are the areas that I'm actually not so good at? And so I want to get better at that. And there's still some worth in looking at those areas where, you know, if you're really not good at it and it's damaging maybe your working environment, your relationships with other people at work or your code, you want to address that. But a lot of your time will often be spent much better thinking about where you can apply your strengths. So as an example, I've picked up some sort of strengths here, and it's quite interesting to have a look at them. So the first one here is WOO. It stands for winning others over. Apparently, it's a very small percentage of the population, only 2% of people have it. But you might know people that are like this. So a really good example about people with WOO is that sort of take them to a group of people that they have never really met, and probably after 5 minutes, they've managed to convince everyone to do something that they wanted to have, or to convince somebody that this thing is a really great idea. This is the strength of WOO. You might know other people who have the strength of analytical, where they're really thinking about all the possibilities of things that might go wrong. You might explain a problem to somebody and they can think about 10 different ways immediately about how you might solve that problem because they're really thinking about all the different possibilities. You might know people who are activators, and activators are people that can sort of excite other people to get started. I see a lot of those people in sort of startups or new initiatives, and sometimes they're not necessarily people that complete things, which is why you might need an achiever, which is a person that's really focused on sort of getting a sense of progress about getting things done. You might have people who have that strength of intellection, where they really want to think deeply and philosophically about, is this thing the right thing to solve? And then you also have people who are maybe got the strategic strength, which is thinking about long-term advantages. So not what we're going to be doing this week or tomorrow, but really thinking about what's the possibility of a year or 2 years. I have a sense, I don't really know this, but I would say that Elon Musk probably has a very strategic kind of viewpoint when he's thinking about putting, you know, people on Mars. And then you have people who might have that strength of input, which is about collecting information from lots of different sources in order to validate stuff. And as a tech lead, one of the interesting things that you might learn about understanding people's strengths is that everyone's really different as a result. It can be both a source of conflict, but it can also be a really great way of actually building a really strong team. You know, as an individual, you will not have all of these strengths. I do not have all of these strengths. I mean, you will have them in certain degrees, but you will not be strong at all of these different elements. And when you do this book, there's like a survey where you'll get those sort of top 5 signature strengths. And your best bet is actually thinking about who are the other people that you can work with who have very different strengths from you, right? So if you don't have this winning others over type strength, you will probably want to have somebody on your team that has that real sort of salesman ability that can convince people that this thing is the right thing to do. If you have a whole team of people who are intellection only, your team will probably never deliver anything useful. So you need some people who have, you know, that sense of achievement and needing to get some progress. And as a tech lead, what you're really trying to do is try to get a overlap of different people across your team to make sure that you have different strengths in your team, because you'll need different things at different times. You know, you don't also want a whole team of achievers if what they're doing is sort of cutting corners in order to get things done. You sometimes need intellection people or analytical people if, say, you're dealing with a really highly secure sort of application where you really need to be rigorous around the types of risks that you take. And so there are different circumstances that we need to deal with, which is why we really want to lean on diversity. And this isn't just a theoretical sort of thought of mine. There's been a lot of studies around the results of diversity. This one was a little bit older, which was in sort of 2012, was talking about company performance and the decision-making ability of the board and what was sort of made up. And what they were talking about is that if there was at least some female representation on the board, they would outperform. So an all-male board would sort of return approximately 12% on equity. But with a single sort of female representation, you get 4% extra, so 16% return on equity. And this applies to all forms of diversity. If you want to learn more about this, a really highly recommended book is called The Difference. It's written by a professor at the University of Michigan called Scott Page. And he talks about what makes diversity work and why is it that we actually care about it. When we were talking about the Strengths Finder book, I talked before about diversity can be a source of conflict. And if we think back to the 10 different opinions and all 10 were expressed in the code base, that's also a way that we can actually create a lot of conflict. And so when we're actually thinking about what makes it effective, Scott Page provides us with a formula which talks about the performance of the team or the collective accuracy of the group kind of relates to the average accuracy of the group in diversity. So what that means is, we don't really want to have a whole random bunch of people on the sort of streets suddenly writing software. We kind of need to have a basis of people who know how to write software to begin with. But what we don't want to have is all software people who are maybe very traditional Java, enterprise edition, and just have that. Maybe we want to have some people who have a functional background, people who have maybe done some JavaScript or Ruby, people who've had some maybe experiences with event sourcing. And as a result, you increase the diversity of the group. But what you need to have is some ability to sort of integrate these ideas. So as a tech lead, you can't just unleash a whole bunch of random people and expect amazing results. What you really want to do is you want to have people feel safe and vulnerable to talk about their ideas and approaches and to be able to understand which maybe combination of those approaches actually make the best sense. So if we have 100 really bad ideas and some of them are good, we might be able to pick out the top 5 of those ideas, put them together, and actually end up with an even stronger problem-solving approach. And this is kind of the formula that Scott kind of talks about. It's not enough just to have lots of diversity, but we need some way of actually bringing them together and finding out a solution. So one of my most favorite techniques as a sort of tech lead is running sort of set design. So if you're familiar with Lean, set design is kind of talking about thinking how you approach a problem from multiple angles. So you might allocate, say, an afternoon to solve a particular problem. You give maybe a few people an opportunity to come up with a way to solve that problem, either through a whiteboard or some sort of coding exercise, and then you get people to demonstrate the result. Often, each one of those solutions will have problems of their own, but as a collective, you might have some interesting ways of solving that problem that individually people didn't think of, but then you can sort of collectively merge together to solve whatever technical problem that you actually have. So we're kind of starting to tap into the diversity of the problem solving, but we're working out ways of then integrating that into our final approach. And this is what, as a tech lead, you're really thinking about a lot. Just thinking about the team culture that you're trying to encourage and the sort of togetherness of the group that you have. When I'm thinking about, from a technical perspective, about team culture, I'd be looking for things like, how long does my build stay broken? So, if nobody cares about that build and they just keep checking code into sort of source control, how long will it take for you to actually fix and find that problem that's causing that? So I want to be thinking about my team and how responsive they are at actually solving broken builds. I want to be thinking about how often people avoid conflict. So I've worked on one sort of dysfunctional team where you would have one developer who would check out code, run auto format, and check code back in. And you would have another developer doing exactly the same thing, but with a completely different style and checking that back in. So you're kind of looking for team smells around what's happening in your code base that sort of help you understand people aren't comfortable talking about this. And this is where your influence can actually have a positive effect about saying, hey, I noticed that we have 2 different styles. We seem to be having a lot of noise in our Git logs. And maybe we need to talk about this and agree as a group how we move forward. I want people to offer new ideas. And if people aren't passionate about learning about their own sort of tools, technologies, and then bringing that into the work environment, that tells me something about the team culture that I have, that it's not open to new ideas. That perhaps that every time that somebody has offered, what about this, maybe they've been shot down by somebody else and say, oh, that's a really stupid idea. I really want to be careful about what that environment is, and I'd be looking to see how often people are actually offering these new ideas. I want people to flag, do they need help? And if you're working in, say, sort of agile teams where stand-ups are a very big norm, one of the big telltale signs that I have is that when you have some people come to stand up and say, I've been working on this task, I'm almost done. And then it's the next day, and they talk about that same task, I'm almost done, and they go on for another maybe 2 more days. When you think about almost done taking more than 4 days, there's probably a symptom that they're probably saying, actually, I probably need some help, but I haven't felt comfortable asking for that. And that tells you something about the team that you've sort of created or you're encouraging. Finally, I'd be thinking about, do people feel safe to admit when they're wrong? Now, the most powerful thing that you can do as a tech lead is actually admitting when you made a mistake, because it creates a sense of vulnerability that it's okay to make mistakes. You'd rather that people tell the whole team that something went wrong earlier so that you can actually fix it, rather than sort of hiding it and trying to fix those problems on the fly as you go. So my theory is that everyone can be a leader. And if you're playing this role of being a tech lead, the question is, how do you enable it such that everyone can be a leader? One of my most favorite methods is thinking about what I call the forgotten agile methodology of feature-driven development. So it's maybe one of the lesser sort of spoken. One of the ideas in feature-driven development is this idea of feature teams. It's something that I guess you're seeing a little bit more today around, say, capabilities around microservices, where that microservice and the team will be focused around, say, a feature or capability as such. Similar sort of idea. And what you're really thinking about is, when you're sort of leading this team, is you really want to be thinking about how do you encourage other people to sort of take on leading maybe the design and all the quality attributes associated with that sort of feature area and sort of architecture style, and how do you sort of distribute that to different people? So how do you encourage people to do that? And this is where I often create the role of kind of a feature lead. So we're still a sort of a team of some sort, but as an architect, you don't want to have to think about all the possibilities all the time. You want everyone else thinking about all the other possibilities and all the quality attributes you need to take care of. And so I would often encourage people to sign up for sort of features to lead the design and responsibility of it. And then as a sort of overall sort of tech lead, I'm trying to provide them the right level of support such that they can actually achieve that successfully. So for some new people to the industry, they may not be able to actually understand performance, security, scalability requirements very early on. So you might need to work more closely with those people. But other times you'll have really senior engineers who understand and can play that, where you can be a lot more hands-off. And so this is where you want to think about, how much can you actually tell people what to do or not? And sometimes you can, but there's a bit of a disclaimer around that. This is where I kind of talk about the situational leadership model. So it's an old model that talks about how you engage with people depending on the task and the skill at hand, right? So we kind of start off with this idea about directing behavior and supporting behavior. And a really good example is that when you have people fresh out of university, they're really excited to maybe write new software. They really want to do something, but they don't have that experience. So they don't have that know-how how to achieve stuff. And this is where you might be able to break things down into smaller steps. And you're sort of telling them, here's how you might go about solving that problem. Over time, you sort of want to help people, they might develop some skill, and then you're trying to help them understand why that problem's an important one to solve. And ideally, and this is the kind of weird inverse relationship with that arrow, is that you want to get to a point where you're simply delegating things, where you know that they have that skill, where you have that confidence, and they're motivated to do things as well. So this model kind of talks about which mode that you'd actually operate with. For instance, if somebody has a lot of skill, but they don't know how to approach a problem, you might actually want to interact with them as well. So you might need to sit down with them, pair design on some sort of attribute, and then sort of help them understand what needs to be done, and then you can maybe move away. And this is one of, I guess, the keys of how you scale yourself as a technical leader. So you're thinking about how you improve your sort of influence and less of that actually doing things yourself. So in terms of thinking about concluding thoughts, once again, one of the biggest reasons why you want to think about having technical leadership is you're sort of having this idea of trade-off between impact and influence. Is that as a developer, you'll only have a certain level of impact through the code that you write. It's still really exciting. I still love doing it myself. You get to solve problems. But at the same time, when you take on technical leadership roles, you're sort of having more influence about broader things, about enabling the code that your whole team can write, or even more, the organization that you're sort of working for can write. One of the biggest things is thinking about being this sort of bridge between impact and influence. And this role of a tech leader is thinking about enabling all the developers that you have and acting as a bridge to helping them become more effective technical leaders. So my key message for you is really thinking about technical leadership is an important thing. We really need to be thinking about what we do with the sort of responsibility, and we can do it for good or we can do it for bad. So think about what impact that you have and spend time explicitly doing this. If you're a developer moving into this role, think about maybe the more influence that you can have and the greater impact that the software system that you write will have rather than the feature that you actually have. We're acting as this sort of bridge between sort of the binary world and the sort of technical world, and it's a really hard skill for us to actually develop and to find that right level of balance. The good thing is you probably have a whole bunch of people here that are really interested in it, so you can probably talk to other people about how they approach it. And the biggest takeaway is technical leadership does matter. Thank you.